So I believe that this this book needs to be read by like every single teacher, especially new teachers. It's funny, I feel like there's like a hard line between like teachers who are okay with the style of learning and teachers who aren't. But this book, I just feel like really builds up that principle of like, how do we get students to own their own education? And so it's funny because I teach business classes, and I've actually talked about these programs at schools or that companies do that have been like awesome, right? Where like Google, I think it's like that. They said that 80% of their results have come from that 20% of time that they've given employees, just like, hey, go do something, right? And like, instead of like telling them exactly what to do. And there's other examples of companies. I think there's one in Australia that did that same thing as well. And so like, it's so funny to me because like I knew about it, but I didn't even think about applying it to teaching. And like, also it's just like, I think the strands and standards are really like shoved down our throats. Like, hey, you have to make sure that these students learn this. But what's so funny is like, I feel like my students have done the best on those tests on years that maybe we haven't even talked about some of the things, right? And like, it just depends on how we review and whatnot. And so I think too often teachers put too much value on the strengths and standards instead of like, hey, like, how do we get students to actually learn these things, right? Because let's be honest, there's times where I have kids do really well on a quiz, and then the next day we talk about the same content that they just did well on, and like, they just don't get it. Like, they did well on the quiz, but then they hit delete out of their brain, right? And so like, I just love the idea of how do we get students to own their education, and like, I want to try to implement this plan into my teaching, and I think it's going to be amazing. And so I'm excited for it. If you couldn't tell, I'm like super passionate about that style of learning, and I think that it means more to students, and students will actually retain things for the long term. I teach financial literacy, and so like, they need to know this stuff long term. It's not just about them passing some test, right? It's about them like knowing how health insurance works and all that for the long term. And then let's see the other thing, limitations of technology in the classroom. So this one's hard for me because I think I do fall into the category of like, oh, sometimes people just want education in the classroom to just say, oh, I have education in the classroom, right? And one of my favorite lines was like, it talked about, it's like, do we have $1,000 pencils in our classroom, right? And our Chromebooks are not worth $1,000. I don't know what school pays $1,000 per student, but that same principle though, even a $250 pencil, right, for the Chromebook. It's not just about just converting it into a low end. It's about completely revamping your lessons and completely changing them. And I think that's where the self-directed learning actually could really make a difference as well, is that if I have the self-directed learning in my classroom, then now I can kind of revamp my assignments and make them completely different rather than doing the traditional like fill in the blank, right? Like, students aren't learning anything from fill in the blank. And so, I mean, vocab's important, but there's lots of other tools and whatnot you can use within the classroom. So I think just following certain principles. So like, for instance, I've done some debates in my class just over like random topics that kids care about, and like they get really into it, right? And so like, the actual debate itself is not online, it's not technological, right? But I can still let them use technology as part of the assignment as far as looking up resources and whatnot and having their notes up with them up at the board. But yeah, I think there's genuine, like the soft skill things really still need to be taught in the class, and sometimes those things aren't just through typing, right? Like, students need to be able to have face-to-face conversations with each other and have debates and things like that. So yeah, game changer though, game changer. So I'm excited to see what happens and how I'm able to implement this stuff.